Well, time to do some more planning, and as we were doing a little bit of a retreat and thinking about what we need to do to get organized for the coming year, it's one of those times when it's not unusual for contract updates to come through and get approved. And so I think one of the questions that buyers should ask and sellers should ask is, what are the Florida contracts that I should be using in my real estate transaction? And what are the implications of any changes that have come by? I think we should talk about that.
There's been some changes, so we need to talk about that.
All right, we're going to talk about it right now. Well, welcome back to the channel. I'm Terry with MVP Realty.
I'm Rich with MVP Realty.
And we were starting to talk about Florida real estate contracts.
Right.
I think maybe one point to mention to people is there is not one or only one standard template to use in Florida for a residential real estate contract.
Especially in our market of Florida, right? We have the two, well, we have more than two, but there's several different contracts that can be used when buying a home.
Right. Now, sometimes when a seller lists a home, the seller will ask and expect a certain contract of the templates that are available.
Right.
So when we're working with sellers, we can advise them about which contract might be most suitable for their circumstance.
Right.
And when we're working with a buyer, sometimes the buyer has a choice, but sometimes the seller has dictated. And so we need to be able to advise our buying customers of exactly what the implications are to the contract that's going to be used for their home purchase.
Right.
And for a buyer in particular, some of the changes that have just been instituted at the end of 2021 in the Florida contract, which is used in most of the state,
right,
and often in our area, not always.
Not always.
That has had some significant changes to the buyer side of getting the contract set up and executed correctly.
Right, and it's important also to remember too is that in Florida we use standard contracts that cannot be changed. Sometimes in other states, you know, when you go to purchase or sell a home, you have your own attorney and he goes through all of the different nuances about your contract. Maybe, you know, he adds and deletes and things like that. Where we do not do that.
No, there are areas that we, as your real estate professional, fill in the blanks and help interpret how that contract's going to be executed for you within the bounds of the standard conditions and the standard sections of the contract.
Right.
But it's not a free-form contract, and it's not one where a seller's lawyer and a buyer's lawyer typically are going to get involved.
Right.
They may get involved if you have a special circumstance, and we certainly always recommend people who have questions about contracts or have special circumstances, could be complicated trusts, complicated other kind of chain of ownership things that they want to make sure are correctly set up in a contract. There are times when those real estate attorneys more than earn, their fee for their expertise.
That's really not expensive to be represented. So it's worth it, especially when there's occupancy issues or there's, like Terry was saying, trust issues and things like that.
Right, and so we're not talking about those kinds of details that might take you offline from a contract, but for the majority of people, sellers and buyers are working within the pre-approved Florida contracts, and these have been reviewed by the real estate professional associations as well as the Bar Association in Florida.
Right.
So it already has the input of the legal side and the real estate market side, and they come to consensus. Now, as we said, for the Florida contract, the Florida template, they call it the FAR Bar contract.
Right.
Florida Area Realtors and the Florida Bar Association, FAR Bar, came together, and they really are the ones that oversee that contract. There are some big changes that impact buyers in particular. Sellers want to be aware because it has an impact on actions that they should expect from the buyer,
right,
and actions they can take depending on how the buyer does in executing that contract.
Right.
And a lot of it's the financing section. That is a big deal for people who are financing a transaction.
It is, and we'll go over a few of those here today, but there are many more that you and your agent needs to be aware of and needs to be on top of to help have a successful successful outcome.
Absolutely. We want to protect both the financial situation of our buyers and the opportunity for our buyer to get the home they really want to purchase, and for sellers for it to be a fair transaction and for all the things to go right for them as well, and everybody have a successful outcome. And it's probably not a stretch to say that one of the things we go back to class for over and over, and especially when these every couple of year changes come out, is contract training.
Right.
And so really do not underestimate the input that we can bring to the table as real estate professionals because of the contract training that we just really invest in over and over. And we've been doing our review and making sure we're up to date based on training we took the last few weeks and the last month. And that's why we want to really talk today about the financing contingency section of the Florida real estate contract.
Right.
And that's the one that had the most significant changes.
It did.
So one thing, the first part of it is, how does a buyer actually fill out that financing contingency section? And there are specific things that once a buyer commits to them in the financing, they have to stick to that path.
Right.
And so what are some of the things you would put in? You'd put in how many days you expect to have as your window for getting a loan approval. That's
Right.
the first thing.
The type of loan that you're going to get.
Now that's significant. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit. What is someone going to choose among?
You're going to have, are you going to get a conventional? Are you going to get a VA loan? Are you going to get an FHA loan? Those things need to be put up front and communicated, and then you're not going to switch from one to the other without having to redo a lot of things.
You might have to amend a contract,
Right.
right, to make sure it's really in compliance.
Right.
So conversation with the lender before we ever submit an offer is a really important part of doing this right, both for the time that they need as your lender to get all the right steps done, and that they know what financial path a buyer is going to be on, so that what they commit to in the contract is in fact the path they're going to stay on.
Right.
As you said, it could be an interest rate adjustable or fixed, it could be those types of loans. All of those things have to line up, and now you're committed.
Right,
So we
because
want to make sure that's done well.
Yes, because the seller, they agreed to the contract based on the things that you told them.
That's right.
And then after they agreed to that, and if you tell them now you're going to change, that could become an issue. Where before, people were able to do that a little easier than they can now.
Right, and there are ways to do it, but it's a
You can still do
formality,
it, right.
and we have to plan for it, and we want to make sure we advise you correctly and or connect you to a real estate attorney if it's more complicated than the template provides for.
Right.
So how you fill that out is the first piece. And the timeline for this is now even maybe more important to understand the implication of saying, I will have a loan approval within X number of days. Say you put 45 days if that's what the lender says they could do. It used to be that we knew what that loan approval meant, that it meant you had to get your loan through underwriting and get a written commitment from the lender that they were willing, based on your financial situation, to fund your loan.
Right.
And that was loan approval.
And that was the end of it.
And it's not.
It's not anymore.
No. Another key piece, as I think many of our buyers would realize, is that if a lender's involved, they most often are going to require an appraisal of the property.
Right.
And people looked at that as a separate step, a separate item in the whole contract to close process.
Right.
And oftentimes what we would see, for various reasons, is that there would be a different date range for the loan approval from the lender, the mortgage lender or the bank, versus the contingency that you would put in for the appraisal and the date the appraisal had to come back. So
Right.
maybe you'd say 35 days, I'll make it up for the loan approval,
loan
and
approval.
45 days for the appraisal to come back because the appraisers might be backed up, or if a buyer was a little uncomfortable with their ability to get their loan approved, they might try to get the loan approval and then pay, schedule and pay for their appraisal,
Right.
and stage things so that they could minimize their out-of-pocket costs if things didn't go their way.
Right.
You can't do that anymore.
No.
So what is the definition now of a loan approval? Within the loan approval defined period, say it's 35 days if that's what you put, what do you have to have in your hand?
You also have to have your appraisal.
So it's the
both
loan
of them
approval
put together.
and the appraisal now together make a loan approval
Right.
in that contract.
So you're going to have to commit to paying for and doing that appraisal even while you're waiting for loan approval.
Absolutely. So there's no staging of that. And that's a really big change that people need to really be on top of,
Right.
because people are used to doing it a different way,
Right.
both buyers and perhaps some people in real estate if they don't do this all the time. And it's something that we want to make sure our buyers are protected by.
Right.
Because once you commit to that, the other thing that this contract requires is that the buyer put in writing to the seller that I have gotten the loan approval.
Right.
Now, which means two things.
Two things, right.
But I've got my loan approval within the approval timeline.
Right.
And that is set up to protect a buyer. If a buyer does not get approved by their lender within that time period, they would send a different written response to the seller. They'd say, I did not get my loan approved. And
Right.
what does that mean for the buyer? That's a path to protection for the buyer. If you don't get approved, you put that in writing, I'm not approved.
Right.
Now what happens? I put in a deposit that this isn't going to work out.
Right, because that contract that you both agreed to had contingencies in it, and one of the contingencies would have been for you to get a complete loan approval. If you don't get that, you can, at that point in time, the contract is over. You can get your deposit back if your agent is on it and is communicated that the difference in you now not getting your approval.
Right. So the contract is set up to give fair balance to the seller and the buyer.
Right.
And if honestly it's a financing contingency can't be met, then everybody agrees, then this contract is over, to your point.
Over.
And here comes the deposit, hopefully in normal circumstances without other issues,
Right.
coming back to a buyer.
Right.
But if a buyer does not put in writing that they're approved and the time just goes by quietly,
Right.
the seller has an option. Now, if I'm putting in a bid on this home, and maybe I've bid on a couple and I'm finally under contract, this is now what I'm thinking of as my dream home. I want this to work.
Right.
I have a loan approval, but I neglect to communicate.
Right.
Uh-oh. Because what can the seller do within 3 days of the end of that loan approval process when they've heard crickets? They
That's
heard
right.
nothing.
I didn't hear that you were approved, so therefore, guess what? The contract is now over, and I can now, I'll give you back your deposit, and I'm going to go and take the next guy in line that offered me more money for the house.
Because in a seller's market and a market of rising prices, it could be advantageous to a seller to hope that you don't communicate or that you don't get your loan approved,
Right.
because they can do better on the next contract, or
might
they
do
believe
better.
that they can.
They believe that they can, and then you're out because you did not communicate in a timely manner of your approval.
According to the contract.
Right.
So, these sound like nuances sometimes, but they are really critical dates to keep track of, from the contract time to the closing, and all the steps in the right order with the right communications are a big piece of what really gives people peace of mind and hopefully less tension and less stress getting from the time that they fell in love with that house and start to purchase it to when they actually sit at the closing table and get the keys and get ready to move in.
That's right.
And we want people to understand that. Sellers, you need to understand what your rights are if someone doesn't communicate, but buyers very particularly, we want to make sure that people are on the right path for protection for a buyer, and that they communicate well so that in fact they get to the closing table.
They get to the closing, and that's what everybody wants to do. You want a successful outcome. You found the right home. Now you need to be able to reach to the end, and it's very important that you are dealing with a team that is going to work with you to get you there.
Right, and your team is your lender, it's your real estate professional, it probably is also the appraiser who gets the report in on time and
Right.
understands the contract. And those contracts are very particular to Florida. And so I would say what caution could be, are the members of your team really savvy about Southwest Florida? Typically, you'll have a real estate professional who lives and works in that market. I'd also hope that someone is working with a lender, and that the lender is dealing with appraisers who understand and are housed in our market, because these contracts are quite specific and could be very different than what they're used to in contracts from other states.
Right. It is very important that you deal with a lender that is in our market, that knows the appraisers, the appraisers that are out there that can get an appraisal done in a timely manner, and is aware of the time limits that they are being held to. That someone from out of state, your best lender that you've dealt with for years, may not understand, may not be able to work in that environment. So it's very important that you deal with people that actually do and understand it.
Right, and that you can communicate with. I think one of the most frustrating things for some buyers, and it becomes frustrating for the seller as well, waiting to find out what's going on, is if a buyer is working with someone, maybe a nameless, faceless kind of a loan approver. They could be online, they could be out of state, even from where the buyer lives now.
Right, and we've had that.
And they can't get a hold of a real person. They don't have a working relationship with a key person on the lending team. And then these dates are coming close. We
Right.
can't reach them, the buyer can't reach them. I don't want anybody to go through that if
No.
they can help it. Let's go through this process
Right.
and make it a really less stressful one, and one with a wonderful outcome for everybody, which is that we all get to the closing table on
That's right.
behalf of that seller and buyer.
You want to deal with a team that you have their cell phone numbers, and we have their cell phone numbers, and
That's
we can
right.
call them up, and you can call them up, and in this way, that's how things are going to get done.
Right. So I'm really glad that we've invested time as 2021 comes to a close to continue to do our contract training and all of our continuing real estate training, because every so many years these contract updates happen and they can be significant. And here was one that was not just wordsmithing, but
Right.
there are some significant and somewhat substantial definition and time frame roles and responsibilities that we now, I think feel really confident that we can stay on top of.
Right.
And if our buyers or sellers have questions, if we don't have the answers, we also have relationships with folks with detailed expertise in our market, real estate attorneys who do these closings all the time, and others that we will go to make sure you're connected with someone who can answer the most detailed of your questions. This is just a general top line conversation today. This is
Right.
not contract advice. Your situation can vary, and we want to make sure that you have the representation you need from the real estate side and from anybody else who needs to be part of your team to get the job done. And if you found something of interest and found the content of this video helpful, I hope you would be open to giving it a thumbs up. We really appreciate that, and it certainly helps the channel. If you haven't already, the other ask I have of you, would you consider subscribing to our channel? Is it really expensive to subscribe to our channel?
It costs you absolutely nothing to subscribe to the
what a
channel.
value.
It's absolutely free, and it doesn't even cost you anything to smash that little bell over there so that you get notified whenever we make another video about our Florida real estate market.
That's right. And when you do that, when you hit the like button, when you subscribe and turn on notifications, it helps the YouTube algorithm to understand who else to share these videos with, so that the right people get information that can be very helpful to them in meeting their goals in real estate in Southwest Florida. And that's what we're here trying to do. We want that to be a great experience for each and every one of you. Now, we're going to do some additional planning as the week winds itself down,
Right.
and we're actually out cruising for a few days. And
we're
what a
out
great
at
way
sea.
to do some planning, and really, it's like a retreat for our real estate business. But we'll
Right.
be back in the office soon. So we'll wish you a really good end of the year. Cheers to everybody.
Cheers.
Here's to a very successful and productive 2022.
Bye now.
See you next time. Bye-bye.